at the very least, just the fact of the possibility that these weapons would be used will probably result in the Russians moving many of their weapon systems even further back from the front line, and that could render some of them, at least, less effective in terms of their targeting ability against the Ukrainians. Of course, that doesn't apply to every single system.
Lamy and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken are heading to Ukraine for a joint visit. It comes at a key time. Ukraine has launched a deadly drone attack, while suspected Russian drones have been spotted over a number of European nations, such as Sweden. It'll be the first joint UK-US trip to the country for over a decade, as London and Washington seek to reaffirm their commitment to Kyiv. Here they are speaking at a security conference in London today.
We are the closest of allies, so I'm delighted that we will travel together, demonstrating our commitment to Ukraine.
This joint trip reflects strong transatlantic support, aligned also with our NATO allies, with our Indo-Pacific partners, with the more than 50 countries that continue to strongly and resolutely support Ukraine. Together, we're working to make sure that Ukraine can defend its territory against the ongoing aggression, that it will be able to stand strongly on its own 2 feet, militarily, economically, democratically.
David Lammy and his counterpart Antony Blinken there. Let's head to Washington now and speak to James Jeffrey, a former US diplomat and national security advisor. Good evening, James.
Good evening. Thank you for having me on.
What do you make of the timing of this trip to Ukraine?
Well, it's very, very important, first of all, because of the very long-term U.S.-British security and diplomatic relationship that goes back 100+ years. And also the capabilities of the United Kingdom complement those of the United States, including weapons deliveries and diplomatic clout. So I'm very encouraged by this. A lot of focus recently has been on Gaza, but the Ukraine war is equally important.
And does the US election play into the timing of this as well?
Okay, the U.S. elections play into every single tiny little thing that happens in Washington these days. But this isn't a election-driven event. This is something that Blinken, of course, has done many times. Doing it with the British is helpful, but it won't have any impact on the election.
Look, there are... in fact, there's a piece that's just gone up on the Times website now about the trip to Kyiv by David Lammy and Antony Blinken. And US government sources are suggesting to the Times that there could be a shift in the US position on whether long-range weapons provided by America could be used by Ukraine on Russian territory. At the moment, this isn't allowed. It is thought that the UK is sort of further ahead in its enthusiasm, I suppose, if you want to put it like that, to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles into Russia, to use missiles provided by the UK. Do you think we're going to see a shift in here? This is what Ukraine's calling for, and it appears there are discussions going on at the moment about this becoming a reality.
It's possible. Of course, as you know, in Britain, Britain and France, with the Storm Shadow and the French equivalent of it, long-range missiles, are more liberal in their use by Ukraine. And they're, frankly, longer-range missiles than the ones that we would be considering, which are the ATACMS fired by the HIMARS. Those are relatively short-range systems, about 300 kilometers. And there's some question in military circles whether they would help the Ukrainians that much, even if they were to target sites in Russia. So that will be one factor. But this administration is extremely skittish, and that's where the elections come in, extremely skittish about provoking Russia, and they're even more skittish about provoking Iran. So I'm not so sure we're going to see a lot more than talk here.
Yeah, it appears that the US might have more reservations than the UK over granting permission to Ukraine to use US long-range weapons over fear of escalation. I mean, we've already done this before, haven't we, when it comes to this conversation of sort of taking the fight to Vladimir Putin, testing the validity and the strength of his threats. We've seen other instances where we've defied President Putin as he's threatened to attack a NATO nation, for example, and it's worked. He hasn't responded. He hasn't attacked a NATO nation. So should we not be taking this fight to President Putin?
I would be in favor of that, largely for the political or philosophical and for the sake of the Ukrainians and Putin's psychological effects. It won't have a big impact on the battlefield. The truth of the matter is the US and the Europeans together are keeping Ukraine in the fight. But to varying degrees, and Washington is at the top of the list, they are skittish about provoking Russia, even though, as you said, we have seen no example of some red line being crossed that Russia would escalate in a dramatic way. Putin is all out to capture at least part of Ukraine. He's not going to change that, but more military clout given to the Ukrainians more quickly can make a difference on the battlefield.
Yeah, the Times reporting this evening, just to repeat, that the US could allow Ukraine to fire missiles into Russia within weeks. That's what British sources are saying after conversations between David Lammy and Antony Blinken today. I know you have expressed a slight doubt about that, but maybe there is an announcement to be made as Keir Starmer visits Joe Biden on Friday. We know that is set to take place. This has come about, of course, or discussions around this have accelerated because it has also been told to us by Antony Blinken today that Russia has received a shipment of more than 200 ballistic missiles from Iran. That will allow Moscow, of course, to hit targets further inside Ukrainian territory, as there are question marks about Ukraine hanging on to some of this Russian territory that they've been able to take in recent weeks. That is a significant move by Iran, isn't it, to intervene to this point?
Absolutely. Iran, of course, has provided drones, ammunition, and other things. But this is part of the growing relationship between Iran and Russia. The problem is, and you've heard Washington threatening sanctions, don't believe there'll be anything of any importance. If there's one thing that Washington is more skittish about than Putin, it's the Iranians. Whether they will escalate in the Middle East, whether they will take the final steps to a nuclear weapon, whether they will do more to close shipping routes. Washington doesn't want trouble with Iran. They could, using sanctions already on the books, crack down dramatically on Iranian oil exports. They don't expect anything on the Iran front. It's more likely that we will give more flexibility to the Ukrainians on use of long-range American missiles, but that still is to be seen.
Well, I think it's very interesting, and as you pointed out in the opening, it's pretty clear that the United States is moving forward in a way that will eventually exceed to Ukraine's desires to be able to go after more distant targets, and that makes sense militarily. It makes sense strategically, and it seems to also fit in with Secretary of State Blinken's comments in regard to the ability to hit those targets and to do it based on a coherent strategy. And that, I think, is where things are headed. So that means not only will the United States probably provide ATACMS missiles and similar weapons to the Ukrainians, but it also looks like Britain will provide the Storm Shadow system to the Ukrainians as well. They've done it in the past, and now this provides an opening to do it again.
It's been pretty clear that the UK wants to act in tandem with the United States on this. We've got Antony Blinken and the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy in Kyiv tomorrow. But until now, President Biden has been really worried that allowing Ukraine to use these kinds of weapons directly against Russia could lead to escalation. Isn't there still a risk of that?
There certainly is, and I think it's not wise to completely dismiss the idea of an escalatory ladder. In other words, that the Russians would see something like this as a provocative act and then would, in turn, escalate, with other weapons. That is certainly still possible, but there also has to be a response to what the Russians are doing in terms of their striking at civilian targets, the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. And also, quite frankly, there's a military reason to relieve some pressure on the Eastern Front in Ukraine. So all of these factors play into this, and the escalatory ladder is a risk, but there is a time like this one where I believe it is possible and necessary to take certain risks to make sure that Ukraine can, frankly, survive.
And we're hearing that Iran is going to supply Russia with more missiles. Do you think that has helped perhaps to shift the view in the White House, perhaps to persuade President Biden that this is the time to give Ukraine those weapons and the permission to use them in the way that it wants?
Yes, I think that's definitely been a major factor, Carol. And I think the key element here, the Iranians are providing, according to the reports, short range missiles to the Russians. The Russians have in turn provided longer range missiles to the Iranians. So they're exchanging different levels of expertise and different types of weapon systems between the two countries, in essence, solidifying a military alliance. And that is something that the United States and allies like the United Kingdom are absolutely against, because that kind of an alliance and the actual transfer of weapon systems like this that can complement existing military systems that each side has, that can be a real problem from a strategic standpoint and from a tactical standpoint, especially in Ukraine.
If we do get an announcement, perhaps quite soon, from President Biden saying to Ukraine, yes, we're finally going to give you these weapons, the ones you've been asking for, you can use them in the way that you want, how much difference do you think that could make?
Depends on the number of weapon systems that are actually provided to the Ukrainians. If it's a sufficient number of ATACMS missiles, for example, and Storm Shadow systems, then it could make a considerable difference. It at the very least, just the fact of the possibility that these weapons would be used will probably result in the Russians moving many of their weapon systems even further back from the front line, and that could render some of them, at least, less effective in terms of their targeting ability against the Ukrainians. Of course, that doesn't apply to every single system, but for some of them it could apply. And that would have a significant impact, at least potentially, on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Just finally, we've got the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Washington at the end of the week, meeting Joe Biden. Do you think we could get some sort of announcement as soon as that?
Well, I think it's very possible. I think Prime Minister Starmer may very well try to persuade President Biden that this might be the right thing to do. And we know that both President Biden and Prime Minister Starmer have been talking to President Zelensky and his representatives over the last few weeks about these issues. And it seems to me that that would probably be an opportune time to make such an announcement. For one thing, it would also solidify the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, and it would make it very clear to adversaries like Russia that there is still a united front in the West that is supporting Ukraine.
Cedric Leighton, former US Colonel and member of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, now CNN's military analyst.